Welcome to Unlayered. I'm Saul alongside my co-host Dave, and today we're doing a deep dive into tokenomics with none other than Matty Tokenomics, and his username on X is literally at Matty Tokenomics. For those unfamiliar with Matty's work, he is the token economics lead at Logos and Status.im, and one of the clearest thinkers on this topic, probably in all of crypto. One of his most recent testimonials was from Ilmoy, co-founder of Tensor, who tweeted out last month that Matty Tokenomics is doing God's work in this industry. And I completely agree. Matty also recently released a massive open source guide called Tokenomics for Builders, which I just finished reading the other day and recommend that everybody check it out. It is that good. And you can find it at linktree/tokenomics. We'll have a link for you guys in the show notes to check out. But anyways, Matty, this is an episode I've been looking forward to for weeks. It's been very top of mind for me these days. And in my view, one of the most important topics in crypto, whether it's investors or builders, but seemingly everyone overlooks.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I appreciate you having me here to get a chance to talk about it.
Absolutely. So I have a bunch of questions. A lot of them come from just different topics you get into in the book, but maybe before we dive into the more deeper topics, give us kind of your 10,000 foot view on, what tokenomics means to you and why you found it was such an important area to focus in on.
Good question. To me, what tokenomics really means is, and some people are not fans of the term, right? They think it shoeboxes it in too much to strictly economics, but economics itself is a lot of things that are not strictly monetary, even per se.
Right.
I think of it as more generally about incentives and coordinating user behavior. A lot of economics is about, right, this theory of if you're rational based on the incentives, you'll do this. Tokenomics is very similar to that. Thinking about within a given system, there's a given objective, right, that we want to have. For example, we want people to not 51% attack Bitcoin, right? Or we want people to, play nice and pool their liquidity. How do we encourage people to do that, even when they're acting selfishly, and even in a decentralized setting where you cannot force users to do actions, right? In a centralized setting like Facebook, Twitter, traditional Web 2 technology, you can shadow ban, you can upgrade, right? You can downgrade, you can literally force behaviors on users. That is not really feasible or possible because anyone can just fork stuff in Web 3. And so it's all about encouraging and incentivizing user behavior. So that's why it's so important to me, or how I choose to think about it. And another piece, I guess, of why it matters to me is I've been investing in crypto since around 2015. Was when I first, was drawn to Bitcoin. And I remember sitting through a lot of the original ICO craze way back in the 2017 days. And there was just so many, not even necessarily scams per se. It's not like they were like, maliciously like, give us your money and we'll steal it. But it was some of these projects were so nonsensical and so convoluted. And so like you put all this effort into making this code that's super awesome. And then you gave no effort at all or time of thought to how the token works. And so I just started to get more intrigued by that. It seemed super, amateur at that stage. And I'm glad to see it having matured a bit. And I'm trying to be a part of that maturation process of not involving, external industry regulators, but as a industry itself, getting more aware of, what works, what doesn't work, not saying you can't try new stuff, but understanding explicitly that there's always pros and cons to any system you use, and making users aware of that.
Absolutely. That's something that I noticed when I first got into, or I guess rather went through my first big cycle, which was 2017. It felt to me like a lot of these products that people were putting out, it was almost like they wanted to just have an excuse to make a token and kind of just find ways for it to add value somehow. And oftentimes they overlook the different attack vectors, or maybe even just don't even ship a product. But I think one of the core tenets of your book is that, hey, let's build a product first that people find useful, whether it's Uniswap or DeFi protocol. And then maybe, if it makes sense, introduce tokens on top of it that can kind of nudge people into the behaviors you're looking for, which is something I resonated with a lot when I did that initial read of the book. Now, so one thing I wanted to get into is obviously this idea of product first, token second. I think it makes a ton of sense. I think one really interesting quote that I saw in the book, I was hoping you could elaborate on, is blockchain network effects are not necessarily stronger than they are in Web 2, but because smart contracts and data, they're all on chain, anyone can see it and copy it. But network effects, in a weird way, become more important for defensibility of your protocol. And so this is it's a great point you're making. I was wondering if you could just dive into where your mind was there.
Sure. Yeah. So when you think of, a founder building a blockchain product, right? And I don't mean blockchain as an L1. I mean, anything built on, it could be an L1, but
Like
anything
DApp,
built on
usually.
this stuff. Yeah, DApp,
Yeah.
DeFi protocol or your product. Like you are building this for a reason. You're raising money, right? People are probably, hoping that somebody, right, whether it's your investors or you, are hoping to, profit from this. No differently than if you're a Web 2, product, right? And there's always somebody involved. Hopefully, this moves towards more decentralized models, right, where you have DAOs, maybe this, this rotating or faceless team of people, like users own it and build it and benefit from it. But you still got to have incentives at the end of the day, right? Somebody's not going to devote their time and effort to building something unless they can benefit from that. And so at the end of the day, you're talking about defensibility of a product and revenue, or defending some benefit that is derived from people using this thing, right? Like, why do people stick with the thing we built instead of just going with this other thing that we did not build, or that is, worse or competes with us? So if you look at Web 2, product defensibility comes from a number of different sources. There's proprietary data that, for example, Uber has about where you requested a ride from and where you're going. And so they use this to train all their algorithms, right? Their machine learning algorithms. That is the second piece, right, of this proprietary technology that they have. No one else has the technology they've built, right? Other people could build similar technology, but they couldn't build the exact same technology without that technology being leaked. In Web3, you have neither of those defensibilities in a pure Web3 business, right? There's lots of businesses that are adjacent to Web3 where this is not necessarily the case, but in a pure Web3 business like a Uniswap, your code is literally on the blockchain for everyone to see, and it can be forked, and actually has been forked, right? That's what the SushiSwap attack was. And the user data is also on the blockchain. We can literally see which addresses are using it, how much are they using it, when are they using it. And so someone could, in theory, copy your code and then reach out to your existing customers in a way that's not really possible in Web 2. And so what prevents, when that happens, as it did happen again with SushiSwap and many other cases, what keeps people using Uniswap, right, over SushiSwap, for example, it's largely network effects. It's largely that you already have so many users providing so much liquidity that it's a better trading experience because it's lower slippage. That means more traders come, which means more fees, which means more liquidity. And it's this cycle that begets itself and makes it very hard for a newcomer to compete against that. And so that, again, doesn't necessarily become stronger per se than Web 2 network effects, because those obviously exist, right, in the winner take all, Airbnb and Amazon and Facebook, Twitter, these type of dynamics. But it makes it more important because it's one of, or pretty much the only defensibility other than purely just like branding, right, brand loyalty. So that's that's a little bit of an explanation.
I found it really interesting in your book when you started talking about Uniswap as being like a really good example of how you can use tokens in protocols, because to my mind, it was an example of a token which doesn't even necessarily have much of a use case at the moment. I mean, they're not even producing fees. They're certainly not giving those to the uni holders. And as you say, there is this defensibility, and I 100% agree with that tokens can provide it, but it's only in the current state of Uniswap, it does feel like a very speculative moat, if you like. Whereas if you had something else which came along, which was actually providing value to those users, to me that feels like a stronger moat. So just wondering why you think that the Uni model is so strong.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I do want to clarify that I think in general, we can look at these tokens and we can say there's elements that they do well and there's elements that they don't do well. I actually agree with everything you said. I think that the Uniswap token messed up quite a lot of things. I think it's still a great example of product defensibility because everyone knows of Uniswap and SushiSwap, right? Of SushiSwap literally cloning, forking, right, Uniswap's code. That being said, so it's a good example of network effects defensibility. That being said, yes, when it comes to actual use cases, utility, value accrual for the Uni token, I think that is largely wanting. People are largely just speculating that if I acquire Uni, at some point I can use that governance power to turn on this fee switch, right, is what this debate around it is going on, and then divert a portion of the revenues to my own Uni tokens, similar to what Curve is doing. But in Uniswap's case, not only is there not revenue going to the token, the protocol itself, for the treasury itself, is not even capturing revenue, right?
Yeah.
100% of the trading fees that traders are paying is going to liquidity providers. So there's no value capture mechanism, and because of that, there's no value accrual. So I don't mean to say that Uniswap is like this perfect token or perfect example of doing everything well, but I think there's some elements they've done well and some elements that they probably wish they could have done differently if they were to go back.
So building off of this, kind of on a similar note, one really interesting trend we've been seeing recently is the rise of Telegram bots. Unibot's the most popular example, but there's now competitors to rise of Banana Gun, and it almost seems like they're taking it's like they're ignoring some of these lessons or general practices for tokenomics. For instance, Unibot, they released all of their tokens at launch, just 1 million of them, so pretty small supply.
Yeah.
And they have the 4% tax. Obviously, 1% goes to the LP, 2% to holders, 1% to the team. And if you hold 10 or more Unibot tokens, you then get entitled to some revenue sharing. And obviously, most of the revenue is generated from that tax, not necessarily the bot trading fees or the spread they put on top of using Uniswap. So I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts on kind of that architecture? Do you think it's sustainable, or is it more of kind of a short-term way to get people excited? And it could be, vampire attacked, kind of what we're seeing with Banana Gun, or just out executed with better tokenomics.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Unibot actually did like a number of things fairly well. I'm not a huge fan of attacks, at least as a perpetual thing, right? It's kind of like this very self-referential, artificially inflates the revenue where you're saying that people sending tokens to each other and therefore it's a tax as revenue, when it's not really revenue that's being generated by usage of the product, right? People could just very easily move on to the next product, and suddenly that what looks like revenue completely dries up, right? Or they just stop trading Unibot and it dries up. It's just it's a different form of deriving value from purely just price speculation, essentially. That being said, I think they did it rather cleverly with introducing it to kind of boost the. It's kind of like a trade-off between the pure Olympus DAO Ponzi type of approach and purely product revenue driven approach, right? Because when you first launch, you're going to be at your lowest revenue. And so augmenting it a little bit with the tax, I think is, not the best approach forever, but I think they've been phasing it out, right? They've indicated, I believe at least, that they're phasing it out over time. I think that's clever, right? I think it was, in the book, I go into a little bit of, you can actually look at the data and see there's a bit of evidence for this subjective, purely irrational, purely behavioral economics bias that people have for token prices in a certain range, right? In this like $10 to $100 range, and
Yeah.
them, picking, okay, there's only 1 million tokens, like put them very squarely in this range in a very smart way that I personally believe like played like a fair amount of the deal into the price appreciation, right? People would have perceived it very differently, I think, if it was this, Yearn Finance like $10,000 token, or if it was this, garbage, 10 leading zero, 0.10 leading zeros, 1 cent,
Yeah.
1 fraction of a cent token, right? So I think they did a few things very cleverly, but I think also the massive security flaw of putting your private keys in a Telegram bot aside, which I have a problem with. I think it's a product
Sure.
that clearly people want to use, right? And so like and I think that's key too, right? Is like you cannot just use a token to make up for the lack of having something that people actually want to use and conceptually pay for using, right? Whether they're literally paying for it or not, right? So I think they found a problem, launched a product that people use, and did some very clever things with the token. And I think that explained the run up. And it's hard to know if they'll obviously be able to defend against these clones. There isn't as much network effect in this type of product as there is in a liquidity pool, right?
Right.
But I think that will be key, is how much of a network effect can they create or lean into. That will be key for their defensibility.
You just mentioned, that liquidity pools have probably a stronger moat, are more sticky. Do you think that maybe people contributing and committing funds to projects is the best way to tie them into it, rather than allowing them to more easily lower costs to move to a different protocol, or not having to invest their own money?
I think there is and if you look, a lot of this stuff is more soft science than hard science, right? And I mentioned it in like the introduction of the book, right? Like there's hard sciences like physics, math, and then there's soft sciences like economics, psychology, right? These sort of sociology. And a lot of this stuff, once you start getting into the realm of behavioral finance, is very, very soft science. So there isn't necessarily like a perfect correct answer, but there is evidence from behavioral finance, and it's my personal opinion, that yes, when you get people to put kind of money on the line or get their skin in the game, they just tend to act a little bit differently. And if you impose, a switching cost, right, whether that's a literal monetary switching cost or more of a psychological switching cost to abandoning this community that you've been a part of to go to something else, I think that does play into loyalty. Like you see this a little bit. I think this was one of, not that they've done everything perfectly, especially recently, but I think this was one of the things that MakerDAO did really, really well, right? And why they got so popular was they aligned the incentives. They had these people, in this community, tightly knit, and then even on paper, even before, or even without actually high revenues, the fact that the Maker token, like, you have to put some skin in the game, and then you can talk about what happens in the protocol with governance, but you also benefit, in theory at least, right, from these buybacks. I think that was a clever mechanism that definitely, increased stickiness, or whatever you want to call it.
It also makes me think that maybe Friendtech are onto something, because to conquer Web3 social, maybe the key is that you need people to be investing money in some way to create that stickiness and build that high moving cost.
Yes, I agree with you. I definitely think they're on to something. I do think in the case of Friendtech, it's interesting where they might have gone too far in the financialization, like securitization. A couple of ways that plays out is, one, the bonding curve is extremely steep, which means that there's basically, in practice, you're putting like a cap on at least organic activity. Then there's a lot of like 3-3, spammy activity, but organic kind of activity. And then two is, you've structured, by the nature of it, you've structured the token such that it is this investment in a person rather than like this recurring subscription to this person's content. And so you've made it this financial asset instead of a actual like product or subscription. So I do worry about that. I think we'll have to tweak that, in some material ways, but I think they're definitely onto something. But I think that also illustrates that there is a sweet spot middle ground, where if you just go purely 3-3 financialization of the, trade your friends like their stocks, I would say ironically isn't as much stickiness perhaps. And you're starting to see this now with this whole like narrative on Twitter of the 3-3ers starting to say, well, duh, guys, like we're doing, this is PvP, right? This is this is not 3-3, but what's the phrase that's just come out? It's like dual or something like this, right? Like we're playing nice with each other for a certain amount of time or to certain, but at some point, right, this is all theoretical. Like we're gonna, the name of the game is making profit. So
Yeah.
I think this is very similar to what you saw play out when 3-3 was first popularized by Olympus DAO, right?
Oh yeah.
Game theory is not that simple, right? Payoff structures are not objective, right? The values of 3-3 are very subjective values that you are presenting as objectively assigned, but as gains accrue, as unrealized gains accrue, right, it becomes maybe more valuable to realize some of those than to keep accruing them. And people have different risk reward profiles, so it's not going to be 3-3 for literally everyone. So yeah, just another interesting use case of, or I don't know, overly ambitious perhaps, or overly gambly use case of crypto, but it's interesting to watch it play out.
Let's stay on this topic actually of social. One, because it's super relevant these days with Friendtech, but the other reason is you mentioned a few times in your book the case study of Steemit, and particularly, a lot of ways you mentioned it, but one I'll bring up is just this idea of high frequency versus low frequency engagements with the product. For example, making an LP pool on Uniswap, you're not doing that every day, so it's probably a little bit easier to control for some of the side effects or exploit vectors. But on the other hand, Steemit was super financialized, where you're essentially rewarding frequent engagement of making posts and engaging with posts, and ultimately it created this cascading effect of incentivizing a lot of botting activity and spamming activity. And so I guess the question is, like, how do we solve for these high frequency engagement primitives for when we embed tokenomics into it?
Yeah, I think that is a distinction that I haven't seen many people draw or recognize, right? And I go into it a bit in the book. Something like providing liquidity is relatively low frequency engagement, right? You choose to provide liquidity, and then basically you just choose to not do anything else, right? Like you just walk away. It's passively earning, rewards. So encouraging that, incentivizing that behavior is relatively simpler, because you just say, here's your incentive for providing liquidity. Great, it's there. Like, just don't take it away. Don't think about it, right? Encouraging active engagement, such as, creating quality content repeatedly, right, and posting it, which is what Steemit was trying to doing, is tricky because there's Sybil attacks, right? There's spam. There's, just farming these rewards. There's a few measures you can take to reduce that, right? Anything, generally speaking, anything that reduces your Sybil attack vector helps with those cases, right? Because then it helps prevent bots. It helps prevent you from just like spam, creating fake accounts and upvoting yourself. But even then, right, you can still have the like 3-3 kind of like pods or alliances that kind of warp the incentives, right? And so Sybil resistance only goes so far. Fundamentally, one of the most effective ways is to structure the reward more as this refund or discount rather than this profit, right? So if you look at an example like LooksRare right now, right, this NFT marketplace, they issue a token reward to try to incentivize people to trade. They also charge a fee for trading, right? But if I trade, I have to pay. If I trade with myself, say I pay a 2% fee, right, on a $100 whatever dollar trade. But if I earn on $100 trade a token reward worth more than that $2 fee I'm paying, and I just immediately dump that reward, I'm essentially locking in a risk-free profit, right? And so what happens is you get these people just wash trading with themselves to the point where something like 90% or more of volume on LooksRare is just wash trading. People literally just contributing less to the protocol's revenue and treasury than they are extracting in value from the emissions. And so that is also kind of what happened with Steemit. Of these rewards were just so high for basically doing nothing that, I might as well just farm this. And so you could, if on the other hand, rewards were a subset of the fee or subset of gas, right? Now it is not profitable to just trade with myself. It is not profitable. I cannot farm this for an arbitrage free profit. So who's going to use this? The people who actually care about this thing in the first place. The organic users that were on the fence or want to try this but say the fee is too high or I don't want to pay this. Now you have an option of giving them effectively from 0% up to 100% discount, and so they can try the product for free. They can say, oh, this is cool, right? And then over time they get used to it, and that fades out over time, right? Because all emissions either fade out or reduce, at least in their inflation rate over time generally. And now you've got this, scale, this network effect of organic users that are using it, and they don't need the discount anymore. They're happy to pay the fee to use this product that they value. So that I think that's the most effective approach. There's other, techniques that like Sybil resistance measures can kind of help on the edges here and there. But I think ultimately it's a question of just simply not making the incentives to mercenary farm this thing, because people will find a way to do that if the incentives are there.
What about, because I think you linked in your book this an article that A16Z put out on reputation systems, and their proposal was, hey, we should have two tokens. One is non-transferable that signals your public reputation on the app, and then one is financial and it's compensation, and that's like the tradable token. And it feels like all these DeFi protocols now, these point systems, are effectively using that strategy where, you build up a reputation, you're contributing to the platform, and then as you get those points, it ties eventually to some, maybe an airdrop, or they just create some distance there where you're not just upfront at every transaction level extracting value. Does that also play into kind of how you see this evolving?
Yes, maybe. I think it's slightly different. Brian Flynn has some good thoughts on this. We were recently going back. He recently launched or released this like Quest protocol of rewards, which is basically a way for protocols to rethink airdrops in general and better align rewarding people with airdrops to actual value add actions on the network or on your product. And I think that's the fundamental mismatch is even with these points that Friendtech is doing, that other apps are doing, the presumption is that they're going to convert in some conversion ratio into tokens of an airdrop, right? And so the points alone doesn't necessarily solve the problem that you're rewarding behaviors that don't necessarily net benefit the product, right? People could still earn a bunch of points by doing this like 3-3 or doing just like spammy activity, right? That they're not organic users, they're not promoting organic usage, they're not really going to be around there long term. They're just farming. Instead of farming a token, they're farming points, but those points eventually convert into a token. So it's kind of one step removed, but it's still largely the same thing, the same dynamic. I think a more healthy approach would be, like Brian suggested, these rotating rewards that are harder to game, because anytime you kind of fix this, this scalable rule set, it's going to be gamed. So I think founders are trying to make this like super automated so that it's easy and simple. But ironically, in doing so, they're making it more gameable, and they should be less afraid of making it intentionally more manual, less scalable, right? Like Brian Chesky of Airbnb said, do things that don't scale. Like this is an airdrop. It's likely happening one time or a handful of times at an early stage in your company. Like take the time and spend it and do it well. Make sure you're getting the most out of it, getting the most organic users, getting a good spread of token distribution to people you want to be members of your community, rather than just like doing some easy automated rule, but then it's just super gameable. So I think that's an approach. And then I think the reputation, the soul-bound or non-transferable, right, reputation token versus the like tradable token is a adjacent concept that has some overlap. But I think also protocols kind of just like combine those two concepts sometimes. And reputation is this very, like trust, right? Reputation is this very like personal thing that flows transitively, right? Like if you say that, oh, let me introduce you, right, to Dave. He's super smart about this topic, and you have reputation with me. then Dave gets some reputation with me, right? That's the way reputation kind of works. It's a social aspect. It's very subjective. It's not objective. It's not to everyone else, Dave has the same reputation, right? So making it tradable and buyable kind of warps that
Right.
versus having this more, I don't know, other distribution mechanisms that more closely resemble how reputation works in reality. And as a result of that, you get some of these governance attacks where people are able to literally just buy the reputation token or whatever gives them, voting power, and then just basically pass a governance vote that exploits the treasury and profit off that. So I think that's a whole separate topic, but I think founders are also too eager to go for token governance and see that as a panacea when it's definitely not.
Obviously, airdrops are super useful and helpful at the start of project's life to get people on board, get people trying the application. And we've talked so far about how tokens can be used as defense mechanisms. But I think one of their real superpowers is this ability to overcome the cold start problem and to bring people on. I mean, basically, that's what Bitcoin was, to build up that supply side of validators to create this decentralized ledger. And it seems to me to have this really powerful mechanism to like produce a supply side, as we're seeing with DeepIn. Or just get over the hump and suddenly have loads and loads of people using a product which doesn't necessarily merit that much usage based purely off the quality of the product alone. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the primary benefits of a token can be overcoming this cold start or bootstrap problem, right? The chicken and egg problem, right? If you need both demand and supply, but it also can be misused, right? Where you end up only acquiring one side of this, right? You mentioned like DeepIn, right? So Helium Network is like pretty notorious, right? They're trying to change this now, right? But up to this point, they basically spent a bunch of token emissions and largely only acquired supply and have really struggled onboarding demand, right? So that doesn't really give you a network effect in the same way that having just half that supply but that much more demand would, right? Because now you've got it benefiting both parties. So I think it can overcome those, but you've got to be careful about, again, which behaviors are rewarding, which users you're attracting, actually truly building network effects and not just pulling users forward in your adoption curve and then having them churn. Right, so if you like a lot of Web3 games essentially did this, right? Like Axie Infinity, you're paying people tons of money to basically try this game, start playing this game, but you're not able to retain them. Right, they're churning, and as soon as this dries up, or as soon as this becomes hyperinflationary, where it's no longer just paying them to, because you can only do that for so long, then they leave, and now you've kind of chewed through your potential, addressable market of users, and you've dumped your token. You just get all this like negative. It's hard to regain momentum after doing that. So I think it has to be carefully balanced to overcome the bootstrapping problem.
Well, let's go to that actually, because you brought up gaming, and one thing I wanted to talk about specifically was STEPN, just because to me, they felt like the closest a crypto app ever got to going truly mainstream. And seemingly they did a lot of things right. There was tons of syncs for GST. The only faucet was just earning it by walking, which is tied to this physical constraint of doing actual physical work. Yet obviously it collapsed. I think people still use it, but obviously it's just it fell a lot from its peak. Do you think they could have done this right? Like, was there a way this could be salvaged? Or is it just really about people want free money for doing something, and there's no way you could have structured these tokenomics to make that sustainable?
I do think there's a way to do it sustainably. I don't think it's exciting and sexy, and so people don't like it. But basically, it's short-term imbalances can occur and last much longer than people, give them credit for, and go much further than people give them credit for, right? There's a famous saying from the traditional finance markets of the market can stay solvent the market can be wrong longer than you can stay solvent, right? So STEPN could go to the moon, even though it's a flawed premise, and I would go bankrupt shorting it before it would actually come back to Earth. What am I trying to say is that in the long run, you need to balance the assets and the liabilities, the income and the expenses, the printing of the token and the burning of the token, the sinks and the faucets, right? It all comes back to this in the long run. Temporary inflationary emissions aside, if they had really dug into the data, maybe tweaked the product, right? But found, okay, how are people using this token, right? Because the whole premise is you're earning this token and then you're getting like discounts, right? And like almost like Groupon-y deals, right? That you can spend this token on. So really digging into the data, what are people spending this token on, right? Like where is the burn pressure coming from? Understanding that from their user and then leaning into that and then balancing emissions with the burn, such that you don't have this just ever inflating supply, but you have this more constant supply where the token actually has a value when I earn it and I can spend it on these goods that I actually care about. I think that would have been much more sustainable and had a much more lasting power. Now, is it as exciting on the way up, and is it as easy as the way up? No, but I think that would have been more sustainable and I think the other thing I wanted to mention was, ironically, or perhaps not ironically, but paradoxically, what some people think of as sinks are sinks in the short term, but actually faucets in the long term, right? If you say lock up 100 tokens, and then in a year you'll get 150 back as a staking reward, that is a sink for a year, but in the long term, it's actually contributing even more inflation.
Yeah.
So it's all about the timing of these inflows and outflows and matching those up, and they've got to align at least in the long run.
So it said differently, because that's actually a great way to articulate it. In STEPN, back in the day, you could kind of spend these tokens to mint better sneakers that emitted at a higher rate, the tokens again. So even though in the short term you spent them, now you're earning 2 times as fast. You multiply this by all the users. It starts to get out of control. And so are you suggesting like they should have just nerfed the rate at which you earned tokens over time to kind of balance that?
Yeah, nerfing the rate you earn tokens over time, especially on those type of like deal. I think it's a little bit of like a growth hack to do that, right? You're saying, okay, lock up your tokens for some amount of time, right? And you'll get more tokens. But at some point, the debt comes due, right? And you've got to justify the growth that you're basically buying yourself time. But if you don't have organic growth and organic usage that is acting as a true sink for this token, you're just delaying the inevitable. And so I think there's nothing wrong with this per se in the short term, right? Of buying yourself time to acquiring more users. But if this becomes the primary motivation that users are joining to do, and there's not this organic usage, then you're kind of fooling yourself, right? You're just kind of bribing people to use the app. They're not really organic users. They're going to churn the second it's not profitable to use it. You're just kicking the can down the road. You're hyperinflating in the meantime. Yes, some of the supply is not currently circulating, but as soon as it becomes unlocked, it gets even worse. And so it's just not a stable equilibrium in that kind of scenario. But if they had used that as a temporary measure, and then now this organic burning had started happening that offsets it, and you ramp down the inflation to match that, now it's sustainable. And yes, everyone's now not able to get twice the emissions, but you've rewarded the early users, right? Which is the whole point of this in the first place, is getting the users, getting the adoption. And so I think it's a lot about like using the right tool for the right job and balancing this, balancing these flows.
I've always thought about STEPN that there surely were a load more revenue avenues that they didn't manage to get to during the bull market. Because, for example, Adidas, Nike would surely have been happy to advertise on their app. These are people who are out doing exercise every day. And then the other one is like governments, insurance companies, people who want you to be exercising so people aren't having heart attacks at 60 and, costing the government loads of money in the hospitals, costing the insurance companies loads of money in the hospitals. So it always when people just say, oh, it's a Ponzi, it seems to me, no, there are legitimately large institutions who are very incentivized for people to do exercise. And it didn't manage to tap into any of those during the last bull market. So I'm sort of quietly bullish for a comeback.
I mean, didn't they make $200 million? That didn't go anywhere. They have resources.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was implemented as a Ponzi, but it had had the potential to not be a Ponzi. I mean, I might put it that way at least, but I think the sad reality is it did end up being a Ponzi in effect for many people.
How involved do you think people should be with regards to tokenomics? How much work do you think they should be doing for the tokens? Is it good to have highly active users or not? And sort of related to that, validators maybe on layer ones, because Ethereum sort of goes for dumb validators, Cosmos goes for highly involved validators. So yeah, just wondering on your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think you have to make a very explicit decision. Do you want a product with user governance, or do you want to have this ossified, governance-free protocol? And that is more of like a political or philosophical question than most people think. I think, because you don't really need, there's not many use cases you strictly need user governance for. A lot of protocols, I think, go to it because there's oftentimes a sense that, if we at least, call ourselves a DAO, or at least have this like token governance, voting mechanism on paper, then we're like safer from a regulatory or legal point of view. Or they go to it just because it's default, or they go to it because the token has literally no other purpose and utility other than governance. So it's an easy one to tack on. But I think founders need to be more explicit about what are the pros and cons of having, this token be used for governance, because the reality is that most governance tokens, not all, but most, have very, very low engagement rates, right? And then you're opening up this attack vector where people can always acquire a substantial number of the governance token and then do funky things with proposing and approving, not necessarily useful proposals. Whereas someone like Liquidity, right, the guys who did LUSD, they basically built this protocol, governance free, it's ossified, put it out there, right, in a very regulatory compliant way, and now it just runs, right? And yeah, you can say it's imperfect and maybe things should be tweaked, that you'd like to tweak it. You can always fork it and do that, but that's got a lot of benefit. It is much more secure because of the fact it is not exposed to governance attacks and just like arbitrary rule changes. Now, does that apply to every use case? Does it apply to every philosophical kind of like political objective for a project? No, of course not. But I think founders need to be more honest with themselves about what are they trying to achieve and why when it comes to choosing to go the governance route or not. Because the reality is, even if you want, and even if you say it is a good thing for the community to be involved, most of the time they're not going to be that heavily engaged and involved.
Yeah, voter apathy is a real thing. It's hard to force people to care about that stuff. So let's go to this. I would love to hear about what you're working on these days. From what I understand, you're at Logos and Status, leading tokenomics for them. I mean, what are you focusing on, and what does that role kind of look like?
Yeah, so many people might at least have some brand, name recognition of Status from its ICO back in 2017, one of the earliest, I believe, ICOs in Ethereum ecosystem.
Oh, yes.
I joined much later. I joined basically the start of this year. But Status has always been about end-to-end encrypted messaging, right? Private messaging. And they're working on some very cool technology that's coming out very soon, fulfilling this, a lot of people talk about it, but not many people deliver on it, this kind of Web3 Discord approach, right? Where it's truly decentralized, truly censorship resistant, truly private, fills all the values that a lot of crypto ostensibly, likes or goes after, but actually does so. So there's that piece of it. And I think along that path, there was, and especially in parallel to kind of seeing what was happening with OFAC and all this stuff that's been playing out in across Bitcoin, but across blockchain, but especially in Ethereum, was this realization that messaging is not enough. And so Logos is this initiative that initially began in Status and is now spun out of Status, where they're kind of parallel entities, or parallel projects at least. Logos is this initiative to build all the key infrastructure that would be required for a network state. So you need, a base layer. You need decentralized file storage, right? You need to be able to agree on truth, agree on, non-editable, non-censorable history, communicate. And so I wouldn't say that any of these single pieces of technology is like something that has never been tried before, but Logos is taking a very principled approach to designing each of these things to optimize for censorship resistance, neutrality, and privacy above other concerns, like optimize for those above all else. And so that's largely what we're up to at Status and Logos. And I am the lead of the token economics team there. It's a small team, just 3 people, including myself. But on a day-to-day basis, we're basically assisting the technology teams, like researching the tech, right? Because they're going through these things and then have potentially a number of potential approaches to aligning the incentives, right, or the economics of the app. There's also the governance, right? There's everything that surrounds the token. There's questions about what assets should we use, right? Stable coins or native assets or Ethereum or the L1 token itself. To give you an example, perhaps more tangible terms, if you consider the use case of a decentralized file storage, product, there is a cost that storage providers incur to producing proofs that they still have the file that they say they have for you, right? And so then there's basically some economics without even a token per se being involved around, given what they're expected to be paid for storing the file, right? And given their cost for storing it, and given how often they need to produce this proof, right? You get different ways that lines up, and then you have a spectrum or a slider bar, or one slider bar at least, is between frequency of proof increasing reliability and decreasing frequency of proof. Increasing frequency of proof, increasing reliability, or decreasing frequency of proofs, increasing the profits for these storage providers, decreasing their costs. And so, quantifying that, modeling that out, thinking through what are the pros and cons of different approaches, right? All that sort of stuff that is relevant to the token itself, but also to the surrounding economics, the surrounding business model, the surrounding governance, all the intersection with regulatory, legal. That's an example of like all the kind of stuff that we're navigating in our role.
Arthur Hayes recently put out a article about the changing world order, US dollars, but also how AI is going to dominate and how storage is sort of going to be one of the cornerstones maybe of the next few years in relation to AI. Is that how you're seeing the market moving?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think like AI, whether it's GPUs for training, right, or GPUs for fitting after it's been trained, or storing files. I think blockchain aligns well with these decentralized infrastructure, projects of adding the incentives layer that is necessary, perhaps, to get this collaboration or this cooperation to do so. So I think that's a relatively strong narrative. It's a much stronger narrative than like the first generation of AI on the blockchain projects from 2017 that were like, some that are like literally doing machine learning with a blockchain. It's, oh my God, like what is happening here?
Yeah. Like Numerai, that was the one I remember.
I mean, very flashy, buzzwordy, but doesn't make much sense when you dig into it.
Yeah, it's hard to do that kind of compute on a very slow L1.
Yeah.
And what about, well, obviously Status has been around for a long time. I remember downloading it at ETH Denver in like 2018 or something like that. The app has changed a lot, it seems. What was the role of the token itself, and is that going to change over time, the SNT token? Because obviously it's like a utility-based messaging platform fundamentally, with these other features bolted on, and wallet and things like that. What's the vision there?
Yeah, so there are fewer degrees of freedom with that token because it already, has it exists and has been out. It's changing a bit. We're trying to align it as much as we can with, the, as a utility token, right, with the app. Um, there are some changes that will be made in line with the kind of relaunch, right, or rebranding of the Status app that's coming out within the next few months, I would say. Um, there's also just the reality of the situation, which is Status also has had some regulatory clarity by nature of past lawsuits, actually. So, Switzerland-based entity, there was a lawsuit or the regulator in Switzerland basically, investigated, hey, was this a securities offering, their original ICO? And then there was a separate lawsuit in the US, actually. Neither found that it was a securities offering, neither really came to a conclusive head. But we still have to be mindful of operating within that, right? And not like putting that at jeopardy. So there are some changes, adding some staking, some sustainable staking mechanisms where it's not just like, printing new inflation for the sake of being able to tell you to lock up your token, but obviously still need to very much retain the characteristic that this is a utility token, which is more formal guide. Like Switzerland has issued more descriptive guidance than the United States or other jurisdictions have, where Switzerland is basically, the regulator there has largely said there are three kinds of tokens. You have, asset tokens, which are securities. You have utility tokens. You have like payment tokens. Now, they're not mutually exclusive. Something can be, one and the other. But being mindful of staying in that utility token bucket is top of mind. Yeah.
Yeah, whilst we're talking about regulation, do you think that the usefulness of tokens, crypto assets, has been held back by regulation? And do you think that we could get a sort of a new swathe of innovation happen if regulations provided more clarity or maybe loosened up some of the restrictions? Because obviously it's very good at raising capital. And if it was possible maybe to give some of the revenue back to holders, even if that means classifying some of these tokens as securities, do you think that would be a good thing and open up more use cases?
Yeah, you're starting to see this to some degree. There's more and more tokenization, right, platforms. The name is escaping me at the moment, but there's this really cool platform that's come along recently that it helps you as a startup do your fundraising in a tokenized way. So the actual equity in your company is tokenized. So you're not like issuing equity and a token, you're issuing a token that represents your equity. And this makes it a lot easier to do things like reward, early users, reward early members of the community, reward, influencers who use your product or promote your product, right? This is something that in concept, even Airbnb wanted to do. If you guys recall, right? Airbnb wanted to give their hosts actual shares, actual equity in Airbnb. And they kind of did this, they approximated it, but they didn't, nearly fulfill what they wanted to do. And in my personal opinion, that is one of, if not the biggest promises for tokens, is unlocking new forms of user ownership. Not, employee ownership, not stockholder ownership, but user ownership, right? I use this product and I earn the token and it represents this ownership stake in that product. I think regulation has held it back to some degree in that, people are kind of afraid or unable to launch tokens that explicitly represent ownership. But I also think that's not the full story, because there's lots of projects that have launched that definitely didn't have necessarily the best intentions or even just the most, well-designed mechanisms, where I'm sure a lot of projects would still launch without these strong ties to representing equity, or not even necessarily equity, right? But just some ownership of some ownership of something. You still see this, right? Like the DYDX token is a famous example. Like it earns the product earns revenue, but almost all the revenue goes to the private company and none of it goes to the token itself. And I'm sure you would continue to see mismatches. I don't think regulation is necessarily the answer, but definitely some industry standards, industry best practices, perhaps a self-regulating industry body, right? Not a government body, but, a council of, blockchain founders and experts, right? Saying, look, you don't have to follow these practices, but these are the best practices for doing so. And so a project can launch without following them, but the users will be aware that, well, wait a minute, why are you doing a 3-month vesting period when the best practice is 5 years, right? Those sort of standards. It drives me nuts, like the lack of standardization in some of the terminology and some of the language and some of the aspects of user education and user awareness.
100%. Yeah, I think we could all definitely use more guidelines like that. I think this guide you put out is definitely a step in the right direction. It feels like this is one of the big issues, is obviously whether it's the regulation side or just trying to get people more alignment who are stakeholders and users of the product and getting them access to some of the upside. I think that's one of the big dreams of tokens generally that we've been sold on since 2017. Wanted to get your thoughts actually on this other problem we brought up much earlier in our conversation, but generally just this idea of Sybil resistance. A lot of approaches out there. I think the one extreme is WorldCoin, where you're literally just scanning someone's eyeball or whatever it is and confirming they're human. And then we have this kind of spectrum of things in the middle, so to speak, whether maybe you're verifying a social account, an email, a Discord, your Twitter profile even, and maybe even weighing that based on how much activity that account has. Like maybe it's above 1,000 followers on Twitter, that it's close enough to being a human, or you could do some graph analysis and see if a bunch of bots are following them. But high level, just wanted to get your thoughts on how you think Sybil resistance will play out over time, because I think it's super crucial that we somehow prove humans are using these products if we're going to give them ownership and give them economic upside.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because it's also a point I wanted to make in the context of STEPN and forgot to make, was I think also playing into it was you have people just faking activity, right? And that's a good example of why this is important. I think it's in moving to your question just now of how do we fix it. I mean, I think it's an incredibly difficult, challenging problem to solve. That is also, I think it's important to recognize, not unique to blockchain, right? Like all these CAPTCHAs, are you a robot stuff is pretty much trying to solve the same problem. And so I don't think there is an easy answer. I think perhaps the answer lies more in social incentives, right? Social structures, because that is just how trust and reputation and these sort of things work, right? In reality. I know who you are or I trust you, right? Because a friend I trust says, no, don't worry, this guy's, he's legit. You can trust him. So I think social aspects could play a big part of it. I think perhaps zero knowledge proofs could play a part of it insofar as you can prove, at least your membership of a set, or that you are not a member of a set without revealing, too much about yourself or any specifics. So I think those are both suitable pieces. And I think depending on the use case, like there are some people in crypto who are very, diehard, you can only ever use, purely decentralized, purely private, right? That sort of stuff. And there are people who don't give a crap about privacy. Like I'm more in the middle of just choose the right tool for the job, right? I don't think everything necessarily, every single use case or every single app necessarily needs to be 100% private. So maybe there's some low risk use case where you're okay with some trusted centralized third party, KYCing you, or the equivalent of just, saying, okay, we did a facial recognition of your face, so we know you're a human, at least, right? We can't identify you per se, but we know you're human. And then telling the party that you're ultimately trying to interact with, yes, this person is a human. Obviously that's not, applicable for every use case. Obviously there are trust assumptions. Obviously there are flaws with that. But I think it's about picking the right tool for the job. And if we can use zero knowledge to kind of credibly show that this data is just being, zero knowledge and open source code to show that this data is just being processed once and is not being stored or, forwarded, that would go a long way to solving this problem without making the like dystopian trade-offs that WorldCoin kind of was making.
For sure. Biometric auth, I think the passkey stuff too on hardware devices like the iPhone feels to me like the step in that direction as they open up those APIs for developers.
Yeah, but then you still, and again, applies to many use cases, but just to be clear, you're still trusting Apple, right, as this trusted party. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. But I mean, they have a huge reputational risk and such,
Right.
There is a jurisdiction. So perhaps, something like that would be closer than, I don't know. I mean, WorldCoin too, we get to trust them. Their code is obviously open source, but it just feels, it feels odd that we would go to that versus something that's already in our pockets. But it's a good point.
Many people subscribe to this idea that all of the previous bull markets have been driven by the innovation, the creation of new ways to emit tokens. So it obviously started with Bitcoin and then forks of Bitcoin and then ICOs, liquidity farming, NFTs, things like that. So firstly, do you subscribe to that view? And also, do you think, can you see anything on the horizon that may drive innovation and enthusiasm over the next few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think I somewhat subscribe to that. It's like a weakly held opinion, I guess, right? Like I think that is one reasonable possible kind of, explanation for why these things happen. It's notoriously difficult to fit the why narrative, right, to things that are happening in real time or even with the benefit of hindsight, because cycles can change so much from one to another. Like it could have just been coincidence, right? Bitcoin comes out and then 4 years later there's a halving and Ethereum just happens to be coming along around that time because people have tried to build on it a couple of years and it hasn't worked, right? And so now there's Ethereum and now there's this new platform that has ICOs because of the way it enables smart contracts, and that's largely coincidental. And then that burns off, but then COVID hits and people all go speculate from their houses, right? And Robinhood and DeFi summer, and maybe that's just coincidental, right? So I also would ascribe to that theory. So I wouldn't purely ascribe it to just like new forms of token issuance, but if that's the case, I do think there are some bullish, horizons. I think you're seeing a little bit early days of like a push for a return to a responsible ICO, standards for ICOs, right? Like not necessarily perfectly regulated or hardcore regulated by the US, for example, but using more friendly jurisdictions that don't have as many restrictions and using, industry set best practices. There are not as many rugs. That would be beneficial. At the same time, you're also seeing a lot of more explicitly, permissioned token launches, right? These like whitelisted KYC, right? You literally can't transfer it to another address unless it's KYC'd, and it could be burned. It's because it is custodial, right? It is not a trustless, permissionless. I would say it's not a DeFi type of token, but you're seeing those as well. And I think I personally believe the like RWA, tokenizing real world assets narrative is a bit exaggerated in many different ways, but I do think it will bring, if not just attention, right? Some more capital into the space. So I think those two elements are both lining up, both slowly growing and hopefully ramp up. You've got Bitcoin halving next year. You've got the ETFs, right, which could, just by nature of the ETFs alone trading, now you've got these spot instruments trading that at least some sophisticated broker or market maker is going to have to be hedging their exposure, and the best they can do that in the future but that's going to trickle down eventually to the spot, right? And so I think there will be liquidity from that gets into the spot markets. So I think there's a couple catalysts that are lining up that could lead to 2024 being a bull. I think you have to balance that with the fact that, and I just actually released a thread on Twitter earlier today, short thread about the fact that this is largely the first halving we'll have in this interest rate environment, right? Like largely speaking, all of crypto's history has been in a near zero interest rate macro. And I think people are just not really, they're just relying on the fact that, oh, the next Bitcoin halving is coming and the cycle will play out exactly as it has the last couple times it did. And maybe, but that is ignoring this really radical shift in macro environment that has happened since those. And so I'm not as convinced about that. Obviously, none of this is financial advice or a recommendation, to go long or go short anything, but just some thoughts.
Like super cycle long. That's what I heard. No, but fair point. I also think, similar point is just every halvening by definition, it's a smaller impact on Bitcoin, and 90% of it's already out there. So it's not going to really move the needle quite the same way it did the last two times. So kind of on this topic, just looking forward, because I think it's a great way to sort of to close this all out. Are there any approaches or projects you've seen with respect to tokenomics that you think are kind of doing things right and you might see more of? I know in the guide you called out Clip Finance, which I don't think they're out yet, but as kind of an example of maybe aligning incentives a little bit better with benchmarking and how they tie that to the token issuance. Anything else like that you're saying?
Well, yeah, I guess so. We can talk about Clip in a second. I guess the more popular, more tokens that people are more aware of. I think GMX has done some clever stuff with like the escrowed staking rewards it pays, right, with the multiplier points. I worry about the multiplier points in the long term, like not being capped, because it could lead to this, like basically these giant whales that have been there for a while becoming exponentially dominant of the protocol, such that it doesn't make sense for like new entrants to join. But largely speaking, I think they've done some very interesting, unique, cool things, good things.
But for GMX, are you saying the multiplier points, like based on specific user actions, can enhance even farther the reward, or even like decrease it? Like, does it go the other way too? Like having
multiplier points is basically this, like it boosts your staking reward based on how long you've been staking. So it acts in a similar way to VE Curve in that it incentivizes staking for longer. Yes. But I think it's crucially has the additional benefit over a VE approach, where in a VE approach, you don't have this explicit opportunity cost of choosing to unstake. Whereas with multiplier points, when you unstake, you are opting to burn this benefit. So there's actually actually giving a switching cost to unstaking, which I think is very clever and plays into these psychological biases that people have. So yeah, I think they did a couple things well. They're also, let's be clear, right, a product that people use and pay for, and they have revenues, right, accruing to the protocol. So that is first and foremost, important. You can't just slap on, right, multiplier points to anything and expect it to work. But yeah, they've done some things well. I think MakerDAO has made some missteps. I'm not a huge fan of how they're, using like USDC collateral and then saying that they're decentralized. But this new approach where they do of like buyback and LP, I think is very clever, right? It provides kind of a floor to the price, reduces volatility, increases liquidity, more efficient mechanism than buyback and burn. Liquidity, as I already mentioned, right? A good approach. Liquidity is their stable coin, but LUSD is their native protocol coin, and I think both are very well designed. Liquidity holds its peg very well. LUSD, not a governance attack vector, but still aligns incentives for people to use the protocol and kind of grow the protocol. And then a couple others that are maybe more experimental, I would say, are like Rye, if you guys are familiar. Much smaller. It is not a stablecoin in the strict sense that it tracks the US dollar at $1, but it's trying to be a stable value. So it has an interest rate that can go positive or negative, which means it can sustainably sustain a flat value, like a low volatility value. And in that sense, it's a stable coin. I think it's an interesting experiment. And like I said, yeah, Clip Finance as a team, I've actually been helping, not on the product or the project or anything, but just helping them think through their token design a bit. Their missions model is, instead of just blindly time-based emissions structured more around KPIs in the TVL the protocol hits, which aligns incentives. It ensures, for example, that the team can't just like delay, and then dump, right? They don't fully vest unless the project grows. So the incentives are much better aligned. You'll also avoid the situation where if there's a temporary downturn or a temporary pause in growth because of a bear market, right? Instead of having this now continuous inflation rate, you have a lower inflation rate, so you're aligning. You're potentially making it less volatile, right? Less vulnerable to organic swings in activity. So I think there's a lot of improvements around aligning incentives, vesting, right? Standardization of those terms, standardization of emissions, likely making tokens looking somewhat more like equity options for startups than they have in the past. I think Jesse Walden of Variant Fund is a proponent of that that mental model for viewing where tokens are likely to go.
I'm starting to understand why you've rated Clips tokenomics so highly, since apparently you were the one who designed them. So
yeah, I'm biased on that one. Yeah, but no, I mean, I think Filecoin to some extent already does this, right? Like part of their emissions are time based, but then a portion of their emissions are based on the amount of storage capacity in the network, so the KPI of storage capacity. So yeah, I think they're doing. I think we should try to move away from certainly just purely linear time-based emissions, because that's just like usually not chosen for any other reason than it's simple, but it's not necessarily the best for achieving the goal at hand. So yeah.
But it's definitely better than nothing, which is the point you brought up in terms of making these things look more like options at a startup. Absent anything else, the passage of time is just, it's a constraint that can just help spread off any sort of sell pressure as people accumulate assets and just incentivize people to stay around longer. I think, but to your point, we could probably make this better and more elegant than just the passage of time. It's a good starting point, though, it seems.
Yeah. I mean, you got to do something, I suppose. But I feel like with when you just, there's other things, right? Like instead of fixing this many number of tokens are being emitted, per block or per, month, come hell or high water, like why not make it, okay, maximum 15% APY, right? Like probably beyond some max APY, you're paying a ton of emissions for very little increment benefit, right? And just starting to be smarter about some of these things is the next level.
Perhaps some others on that point are to prevent, like you mentioned, the whales, kind of the rich getting richer. If you were to have multipliers, for instance, on GMX, and you could introduce constraints where, or maybe the absolute cap you can earn is like the 99th or even the 99.9th percentile, and anything beyond that gets filtered down and capped in terms of upside. Or even just like taking the multiplier itself and having like negative multipliers. If you, for instance, just have a tendency to dump all your tokens as soon as you earn them, then maybe you get assigned some Boolean flag and, you get like a 0.75 multiplier or even more aggressive penalty for not holding it. I think I've seen these approaches in other systems that could potentially align things a bit better too.
And Multicoin just recently did a really good article, I'm not sure if you saw it, on deep in tokenomics. And in there, they made the same differentiation that there are some projects which do it on a time-based and some more on KPI. And their view is you should only really do time-based emissions if the core KPI you're going for is just speed to market. If you're just trying to beat out the competition and build up a large enough network effect, then sort of that's the only real reason you should be just emitting it like that. Maybe Bitcoin being a good example of something like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that article's on my reading list, but I haven't gotten through it yet. But it's good to hear they're more or less on the same page, it sounds like. And in regards to these like capping mechanisms, and like a lot of tokenomics is making sure these things are balanced, right, in the long run. Like any complex system design, right, you're trying to avoid these like exponential spirals one way or another, and so you want to implement these decaying functions or just equilibriums as much as possible. But some approaches to that, like quadratic voting, for example, essentially assume that a whale isn't going to just Sybil attack you and split up their stake into multiple different wallets, right? And act like they're
Yeah.
10 smaller players instead of one big, right? So a lot of it all comes back to Sybil resistance in the end.
Yeah.
But yeah.
That's where you need WorldCoin. But you
Yeah.
also mentioned decaying. Decaying, is that referred to like if you're like super early and you have a giant pile of tokens you earned and you don't do anything, like the value of that goes down over time or they get burned? Like how would that work?
Well,
exactly?
no, I meant more just like you don't want growth rates to like just spiral out. Like, yeah,
got it.
Like you need to think through carefully. Like, is this factor going to grow exponentially, grow linearly, or grow sublinearly with with other factors, right? And just trying to balance all of these things and align them such that the protocol doesn't end up spinning out of control in this hyperinflationary way or in this just net destructive way that we've seen in death spirals that have played out.
Gotcha.
It's hard to generalize, too, because there's so many different. The design space is so rich, but yeah, I mean, like that is in general the principle that you're trying to design for is put this thing through the ringer with scenario analysis and see that it actually holds its assumptions and is relatively stable. And if it isn't, then you got to tweak it and figure out how do we dampen down this factor that's introducing this risk, but trade that off with this thing. It's all a matter of trade-offs, right? It's an optimization problem. There's no perfect tokenomics.
Anything you're just sort of hyper bearish on that hasn't been washed out during the bear market?
That is a good question. Let me pull up CoinMarketCap and see what's up here. I still can't believe Dogecoin, these meme coins, are still lasting so long. I mean,
oh yeah,
that is it's wild to me that in 2023 Dogecoin is still in the top 10 by market cap.
I did think about Dogecoin whilst reading a book, because you do say you can't just create a token and have zero utility, zero value, and then lo and behold in the top 10 there is one.
Yeah, there's always an exception to every rule, right? I mean, I do think in general that advice still holds. It is the most difficult use case is just being a new form of money, right? I think Bitcoin kind of like warped people's perceptions of like, just launch a token and people will treat it like it's money, right? Like, no, it's not true for 99.99999% of projects, right? So yeah, I'm bearish meme coins in the long run, right? It might be a very slow bleed, but they're gonna bleed out at some point. Again, the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. I would never short one of these things, right. but yeah, don't see much of a bull case for it. I think L2. This might be a more interesting take. I think L2s have survived, like Optimism and Arbitrum, those tokens largely survived or first succeeded a lot on just like the excitement around the initial distribution event, the fact that the tech is new, the fact that the networks are new, and now you can pay low gas fees, and we got this cool airdrop that made everyone rich. But why do you need the token, right? Like, you don't use it to pay gas. Mm-hmm. You use it to have governance, but Arbitrum doesn't even, they just ignore your governance vote anyway.
Yeah.
So, right, like I think L2s kind of have a bit of a pending value accrual crisis on their horizon that I think will come to fruition at some point soon. Might be longer than I'm expecting, but I think at some point we'll have to cross that bridge.
Well, we obviously covered a lot of stuff today. Much of it has been inspired by this Tokenomics for Builders guide that Matty, you put out. One of the interesting things I saw in there is there's like additional resources people can use. One of which is the Tokenomics Design Canvas, which I didn't even know existed until I read this guide, but it's almost like a completely separate methodical framework that you work through, where you basically define all the stakeholders, motivations, and work through like different scenarios that could cause your token to do well or not do well. Just tell us a bit about what resources you made available for builders.
Yeah, I mean the whole guide in general began when like the inspiration was I was speaking to the graduating classes from a cohort of a Web3 accelerator, and they all basically had the same exact questions, right? Everything from like how long should our tokens be vesting, and what percentage of tokens, right, should we get, to the more nuanced stuff around utility and regulation and where do we launch and how do we issue. So I quickly realized it doesn't make sense to just answer these one by one. I should put together a more resource, a specific resource. And that became this guide. And part of that is the Tokenomics Design Canvas, which is this, similar to the business model canvas, these frameworks, right, that you go and fill out, you complete in order to specify, right, how does your token work? How is it minted, created, destroyed, used, etc. There's the one of the most crucial aspects is the incentive mechanism. So one of the worksheets in the Tokenomics Design Canvas is thinking through like who are each of the roles. In a Uniswap example, right? There'd be a liquidity provider is a type of role, and a trader is a type of role, right? And then they have different motivations, right? And so thinking through their motivations, thinking through how you incentivize them to do what you want them to do, and disincentivize them from doing what you don't want them to do, and then seeing where do those conflict, right? Because you sometimes have directly contradictory incentives, right? Traders want to pay less fees, so you can incentivize them to trade more by charging them less. But LPs want to be, rewarded for taking on volatility risks and permanent loss. So all else equal, charging higher fees, right, encourages them. So it helps you just explicitly raise to the foreground, these are the things that I now need to go and actually like quantify, model, right, explicitly optimize. And so that's what the Tokenomics Design Canvas does. It even has some more Excel-based and Python-based tools for modeling. It's literally a step-by-step process to design the first approach to your token. It's been used by now, I would say at least probably 50 teams in various different cohorts of accelerators, incubators, and projects I have spoken to about it, and projects we're using in Status and Logos. So it's not, it's pretty battle tested. It's not something that is unproven. It's not the only way to approach this stuff, but it is. It usually works, or at least gets you out on the right foot. So yeah, for people who want to find it, hopefully they can go that links in the show notes, the Linktree Tokenomics, and it's in there, the Tokenomics Design Canvas.
Amazing. Yeah, I truly have not seen anything remotely as comprehensive as this guide you put out. So thank you for putting it out, open sourcing it for all these teams to use, and for your contributions to this broader discussion. And thank you so much for joining us today, Matty. It's been a very informative chat.
Thanks for having me.